Chuck Norris wasn't born a warrior, he was born into chaos. His real name was Carlos Ray Norris, and he entered the world in 1940 in the small town of Ryan, Oklahoma. Long before he became a legend in martial arts and movies, Chuck was just a scared little boy growing up in a house that felt more like a war zone than a home. His father, Ray Norris, had served in World War II, and like many men who came back from the front lines, Ray didn't return the same. Chuck's family once received a telegram claiming Ray was missing in action, a notice that sent his wife and children into a panic. He eventually came home, but something inside him stayed broken. He turned to alcohol, and the man who should have protected his family became the one they feared the most. Here's where things took a darker turn. Instead of being the hero his sons could look up to, Ray became unstable and violent. Chuck would later write in his memoir Against All Odds that his father was a negative role model, the kind of man he swore he'd never become. His mother, Wilma, tried to hold the family together, but with 3 hungry boys and no real income, it was a daily struggle just to survive. Chuck remembered watching his mom hide $5 bills under the sink just so she could buy food, but Ray would often find it, take it, and disappear in a drunken haze. There were nights when even the sound of running water or a door closing would set him off. Chuck, still a child, lived in a constant state of fear, tiptoeing around his own home as if any moment could explode into chaos. But what happened next would leave a permanent scar. One night, when Chuck was just 14 years old, Ray got so drunk and enraged that he loaded the whole family into the car and started driving them across state lines while weaving dangerously on the road. Wilma cried in fear, and the boys sat in silence, terrified. Chuck never forgot that ride, or the feeling of complete helplessness. And then came the moment that changed everything. Later that same year, during another outburst, Chuck stood between his father and mother, armed with nothing but a hammer in his trembling hands. It was a last-ditch effort to protect her. He was just a kid, but in that instant, he became a man. He didn't swing the hammer, but his stance was enough. Ray paused, and Chuck made a silent vow in his heart. He would never let fear control his life again. That decision would define the rest of his life. It wasn't a clean break. The abuse continued, but eventually Wilma found the courage to escape. In 1956, when Chuck was 16, she packed up her sons and moved them to California, leaving Ray, and the nightmare, behind. It was the first time Chuck saw what real strength looked like, not in a punch or a kick, but in a mother walking away from pain to protect her kids. This wasn't the end of Chuck's struggle, but it was the beginning of his transformation. The moment the fragile, frightened boy started becoming the man the world would one day admire. After leaving behind the chaos of his early home life, Chuck Norris was determined to find something that could give his life structure, something that could erase the fear and weakness he'd lived with for so long. In 1958, at just 18 years old, he enlisted in the United States Air Force. It wasn't just about serving his country. For Chuck, it was a lifeline, a way to build a new future away from the shadows of his past. He was stationed at Osan Air Base in South Korea, and it was there that everything began to change. This is where martial arts entered his life. At first, he didn't look like a fighter. Chuck admitted in interviews that he was quiet, introverted, and not very athletic. He wasn't the star quarterback or the class president. He didn't think of himself as strong, but when he first stepped into a martial arts class and began training in Tang Soo Do, something clicked. He fell in love with the idea that power could be earned, not inherited. Martial arts didn't just build his body, it rebuilt his confidence. Chuck trained relentlessly. He failed, he fell, and he got back up again. Every punch, every kick, every repetition was his way of chipping away at the frightened boy he used to be. He wasn't just learning to fight, he was learning discipline, focus, and patience, and it didn't stop there. By the time he returned to California in 1962, Chuck was no longer just a shy kid from a broken home. He had transformed into a man with a mission. He took a job as a military police officer, but his real dream was to open a karate school. And despite having almost no money, no business background, and very few students, he opened one anyway. It was a modest start. Most days the school was nearly empty. Chuck would sweep the floors himself, practice alone, and sometimes go hours without a single student walking through the door. But here's what made it different. He never gave up. Every defeat, every empty class, every unpaid bill, it all reminded him of the hammer he once held as a boy. He wasn't just teaching martial arts to strangers, he was still fighting for that terrified kid from Oklahoma. And this time, he refused to lose. He began entering karate tournaments to test his skills, but the first few years were brutal. From 1964 to 1967, Chuck lost again and again. The physical pain was one thing, but emotionally, it was like reliving every failure from childhood. The self-doubt crept in. Was he good enough? Would he ever be taken seriously? Instead of walking away, he doubled down. Night after night, he returned to training. He drilled every stance, every move, every breathing technique, until they became second nature. He wasn't born a champion. He had to build himself into one. And finally, in 1967, at the age of 27, all the hard work paid off. Chuck Norris won his first major karate championship. And with that victory, the door to a whole new chapter cracked open. The frightened boy was gone. In his place stood a man who had not only learned to fight, but had learned to believe in himself. This wasn't just a win, it was a turning point. The same discipline that helped him survive his childhood was now becoming his greatest strength, and while the world still didn't know his name, Chuck had already conquered the biggest battle of all, his past. By 1967, Chuck Norris had earned his first major victory in competitive karate, but that was only the beginning. Between 1968 and 1974, he became a dominant force in the martial arts world, holding the title of professional middleweight karate champion for 6 straight years. His victories weren't about brute strength or flashy moves. Chuck had a methodical, almost surgical way of dismantling his opponents. He fought with precision, control, and a mindset that had been forged through pain and poverty. What made him different was his reason for fighting. He wasn't trying to prove anything to the crowd, he was trying to prove something to himself, that he wasn't defined by his broken home, his failures in school, or his quiet nature. Every time he stepped onto the mat, it was another chance to rewrite his story. But here's where the story takes another leap. Instead of sitting comfortably at the top of the karate world, Chuck decided to expand his mission. He began opening karate schools across California, not as a businessman chasing profit, but as a teacher. He believed martial arts could give kids the same confidence and purpose that it gave him. At each school, he taught more than just punches and kicks. He emphasized respect, humility, discipline, and inner strength. Parents noticed the change in their children. Kids who once struggled with self-esteem were standing taller, speaking more clearly, and showing real confidence. And while Chuck was inspiring others, someone else was watching him closely. Hollywood. His clean-cut image, calm demeanor, and reputation as a real-life champion made him stand out in a world full of scripted tough guys. But Chuck's first big break didn't come from an audition. It came from a friend. In 1972, legendary martial artist Bruce Lee reached out and invited Chuck to appear in a film with him, The Way of the Dragon. The two had known each other through the martial arts circuit, and Bruce respected Chuck's skill. The resulting film would become iconic, with the two facing off in a dramatic fight scene inside the Colosseum in Rome. This wasn't just a fight scene, it was cinematic history. Audiences around the world were glued to the screen. Chuck Norris, still relatively unknown outside martial arts, held his own against Bruce Lee, who was already a global superstar. And even though Bruce won the fight in the film, Chuck made such an impression that doors in Hollywood started to crack open. But success in movies didn't happen overnight. After The Way of the Dragon, Chuck struggled to find solid footing in the film industry. The late 1970s were dominated by action giants like Sylvester Stallone and Arnold Schwarzenegger, and Chuck's quiet style didn't immediately grab headlines. Still, just like with karate, Chuck refused to quit. He continued acting, training, and working behind the scenes to develop stories that fit his values: honor, justice, and self-control. He wasn't interested in just punching his way through buildings. He wanted his characters to have meaning. Then in 1978, everything changed. Chuck starred in Good Guys Wear Black, a low-budget action film that surprisingly performed well at the box office. It gave Chuck the foothold he needed. He wasn't just a martial artist anymore, he was now a leading man. This moment mattered. because it marked the beginning of Chuck Norris becoming a symbol, not just of physical strength, but of moral strength. He was the quiet hero who didn't curse, didn't cheat, and didn't quit. And finally, the world began to notice. As the 1980s rolled in, Chuck Norris was no longer just a martial arts champion. He was becoming a full-blown action star. After the success of Good Guys Wear Black, he followed up with a string of hits. The Octagon, 1980, Lone Wolf McQuade, 1983, Missing in Action, 1984, Code of Silence, 1985, and The Delta Force, 1986. Each role built on the last, shaping Chuck into the image that audiences came to love. The silent warrior, the man who stood for justice, who never flinched, never failed, and never backed down. But behind every on-screen victory was a private wound that never healed. That wound was named Wieland Norris, Chuck's younger brother. Wieland had been the light in Chuck's childhood. While their father's abuse left lasting scars, Wieland brought laughter and warmth into the home. He was known for being optimistic, funny, and full of life, but that light was extinguished far too soon. In 1970, while serving in the Vietnam War, Wieland was just 21 years old when he was killed in action. He had been walking point for his unit, leading a patrol when he spotted an enemy ambush. Rather than fall back, he shouted a warning to save his fellow soldiers, and in doing so, lost his own life. The news shattered the Norris family. Chuck once said, "His death left a hole in my heart that will never heal." For a man who had made a career out of portraying warriors and soldiers, this loss wasn't just personal, it was spiritual. Every time Chuck suited up in military gear for a role, every time he held a rifle on screen, he was reminded of the brother who didn't get to come home. And that's what gave his performances something more. Audiences didn't always know why Chuck's characters felt so real, but it was because the pain was real. The grief, the guilt, the memory of that telegram, all of it lived inside him, long after the cameras stopped rolling. Even as he was becoming America's favourite action hero, Chuck was fighting a silent war inside. He didn't talk about it much in public, but his family knew. Wieland wasn't just a brother, he was a part of Chuck's soul, a part that was ripped away in the jungle, never to return. And that pain didn't fade, it simply became part of who he was. Still, Chuck pushed forward. He worked harder, trained longer, and committed himself to his career. Not just for himself, but almost as if he was living for two people now, him and Wieland. But fame came at a cost. The filming schedules were brutal. The stunts took a physical toll. Chuck began suffering from chronic pain, injuries, and long stretches away from his family. Yet he never let it show on camera. To the world, he was still the man who could take a beating and never blink. But at home, the cracks were beginning to show. The grief, the pressure, and the distance from his loved ones weighed heavy. Chuck had built a career on discipline, but even the strongest walls can begin to buckle under that kind of emotional strain. And as the 1980s drew to a close, Chuck would face a heartbreak far closer than Hollywood or Vietnam, a storm brewing inside his own home. By the end of the 1980s, Chuck Norris had conquered Hollywood, but his home life was falling apart. In 1958, at just 18 years old, Chuck had married his high school sweetheart, Diane Holchek. Through his years in the military, the struggles to grow his karate schools, and his rocky rise to stardom, Diane had been a constant. They had two sons together, Mike, born in 1962, and Eric, born in 1965, and for 30 years, Chuck believed he had built a solid foundation. But fame comes with pressure. The film sets, the travel, the stunts, and the public demands chipped away at their relationship. Chuck was away more than he was home, and though he tried to be present for his sons, the emotional distance only widened. And in 1988, the foundation cracked for good. Chuck and Diane separated, and after 3 decades, their marriage ended in divorce. To outsiders, it looked like just another celebrity breakup, but for Chuck, it was something else entirely. He described it as a devastating blow, a failure that hurt more deeply than anything the public could see. But that wasn't the only surprise waiting for him. Not long after the divorce, Chuck received a letter from a woman named Dinah, born in 1962, the same year his son Mike was born. She claimed to be his daughter, the result of a brief affair Chuck had during his military service. Her mother had kept the secret for decades, not wanting to disrupt his marriage. At first, Chuck was stunned, but when he looked at her face, he saw himself. The revelation hit him like a truck. For 26 years, he had unknowingly missed every milestone in Dina's life. Her first words, her first steps, her graduations. The guilt was overwhelming. Chuck, a man raised in a broken home, had unknowingly repeated the same cycle for another child. But this time, he did something different. He stepped up. He reached out to Dina and her mother, not with excuses, but with humility. He asked for forgiveness. He tried to make up for lost time. And slowly, they began to build a relationship. Chuck would later say that Dinah became a blessing in his life, but that didn't erase the regret. He carried that guilt quietly, always wondering what could have been if he had known. It was a different kind of pain, not born from violence or war, but from absence. And unlike his martial arts battles, this was one he couldn't win with strength. Meanwhile, his sons were watching it all unfold. They had grown up seeing their father as a symbol of power and purpose, but now they saw the man behind the myth, a man who cried, who failed, who tried to fix what he could and carry what he couldn't. Chuck's story wasn't about perfection, it was about persistence. Even when life shattered what he thought was unbreakable, he chose to move forward. He didn't run from the pain, he sat with it, faced it, and tried in every way possible to turn it into something better. This period of Chuck's life was raw and revealing. It showed that even the strongest men can be brought to their knees, not by a punch or a fall, but by the realization that time lost can never be returned. And yet, Chuck kept going. He kept building. He kept showing up for his sons, for Dina, and for himself. But life wasn't done testing him. Just when Chuck Norris thought he was learning how to navigate loss, life hit him again. In the late 1980s, Chuck developed a close friendship with Lee Atwater, a rising star in American politics. Atwater was brilliant, witty, and full of life. He wasn't from the film world, but he and Chuck bonded over late-night conversations, laughter, and a rare kind of trust that went beyond headlines or appearances. They were an unlikely pair. One was a martial arts icon known for discipline and quiet strength. The other was a fast-talking political strategist with charisma to spare. But the friendship was real. For Chuck, it was refreshing. Someone who didn't want anything from him, who saw the man, not the movie star. Then came March 1990. Atwater was giving a speech when he suddenly collapsed on stage. He was rushed to the hospital, and within hours doctors gave a grim diagnosis, an inoperable brain tumour. He was just 39 years old. Chuck was devastated. This wasn't the battlefield. It wasn't Hollywood. This was real life, and this time there was nothing to fight. No script, no training, no comeback. Just a friend slipping away with every passing day, and Chuck watched it all happen. He visited Lee as often as he could. Each time the change was more brutal. The man who had once filled rooms with laughter could barely speak. His once sharp eyes faded, his energy drained, and Chuck, who had seen war, loss, and divorce, was shaken in a way he hadn't felt before. He later recalled one visit in painful detail. He leaned down, kissed Lee's forehead, and walked out of the hospital room. As soon as the door closed behind him, he broke down in tears, overcome by the cruel speed with which life was stealing his friend. In March 1991, just 1 year after his collapse, Lee Atwater passed away. For Chuck, it was more than the loss of a friend. It was a brutal confrontation with his own mortality. If a man as sharp and full of life as Lee could be gone in a year, then so could anyone. Even him. If it could happen to him, it could happen to me, Chuck later admitted. It was a sobering truth. For decades, Chuck had been seen as invincible. But watching Lee fade away stripped off the last layers of that illusion. This loss didn't come with action sequences or applause. There were no special effects to soften the blow, just silence. Just the weight of watching someone you care about vanish before your eyes. It forced Chuck to reassess everything, his priorities, his time, his relationships. It was another painful reminder that no amount of fame, strength, or fortune could shield him, or anyone, from the reality of being human. And yet, even in the sorrow, something remained. Lee's friendship had meant something. The memory of those nights talking about life, dreams, and purpose stayed with Chuck. And instead of letting the grief drown him, he let it refocus him. He began thinking more seriously about how he wanted to spend his remaining years, not just making films, but making an impact on his family, on young people, and on anyone who might walk the same painful paths he had walked. Chuck was facing the truth. No man lives forever, but how you live and who you love can echo long after you're gone. After decades of heartbreak, Chuck Norris finally seemed to find peace. In 1998, at the age of 58, he married Gina O'Kelly, a former model who was 23 years younger. Their bond was genuine, filled with mutual respect, love, and a shared desire to build a life beyond the spotlight. For the first time in years, Chuck seemed truly content. In 2001, they welcomed twins, Dakota and Danilee, into the world. Chuck, now in his 60s, found joy in fatherhood again. Their home was filled with the laughter of children, the quiet beauty of stability, and the hope of a second chance. But life wasn't done testing him. In 2013, Gina went in for what should have been a routine MRI scan. As part of the procedure, doctors used a contrast dye containing gadolinium, a substance meant to improve imaging results. But instead of helping, it triggered a devastating chain of events. What followed was a nightmare. Shortly after the scan, Gina began experiencing alarming symptoms. Her body trembled uncontrollably, her muscles weakened, her limbs went numb. Her voice faltered, sometimes disappearing entirely. The once radiant woman Chuck had married was now fighting to move, to speak, to survive. Doctors were baffled. They ran tests, tried treatments, but nothing stopped the decline. Over time, they diagnosed her with what's now referred to as gadolinium deposition disease, a rare and poorly understood condition that affects the nervous system. Chuck was crushed. He had played heroes for decades. But this wasn't a scene he could fight his way out of. There were no stunt doubles, no scripts, just long nights in hospital rooms, praying she'd wake up stronger than the day before. He poured over $2 million into her treatments, travelling across the country, even flying to China for stem cell therapy in hopes of restoring her quality of life. He didn't care about the cost, he just wanted Gina back, and he gave up everything else. Chuck stepped away from acting, from Hollywood, from public life. No more appearances, no more film roles, no more red carpets. Just a husband at his wife's bedside, day after day, month after month, refusing to let her go through it alone. "She's dying right in front of me," Chuck said in a rare interview, his voice trembling with emotion. For someone who had spent a lifetime playing invincible characters, this was the most vulnerable he had ever been. Fans still saw him as the indestructible Walker, Texas Ranger, but behind the scenes, he was just a man trying to hold his family together. And it wasn't just him. Their twins, only 12 at the time, were forced to grow up quickly. Hospital visits became routine. They saw their mother's body betray her. They saw their father cry. And those memories became part of their childhood. Gina's suffering wasn't just physical, it was emotional. She watched the man she loved sacrifice everything for her, and that knowledge weighed on her just as heavily as the illness itself. The guilt of watching him give up his career and public life became another layer of pain she couldn't escape. Still, Chuck never left her side. He became her nurse, her protector, her advocate. The strength he once used to break boards and defeat enemies on screen was now used to hold her hand, lift her gently from bed, and fight for answers when no one else would. This was a different kind of heroism, not the kind that wins awards or sells movie tickets, but the kind that wakes up every day to the same painful reality and stays anyway. The kind that whispers, "I'm not leaving," even when there's nothing left to say. And through it all, Chuck proved once again that his greatest strength wasn't in his fists, but in his love. Today, at 85 years old, Chuck Norris lives far from the bright lights of Hollywood. He resides with Gina on a sprawling ranch in Navasota, Texas, a place filled with still lakes, open skies, and wide acres of land. It's a private sanctuary, valued in the tens of millions, where the family raises horses and bottles, Seaforce, a spring water brand Chuck turned into a business. On the surface, it looks like peace, but under that surface lives a man shaped by deep scars. His days now revolve around caring for Gina, who continues to feel the effects of her health crisis, While her condition has stabilised, the past decade has left lasting damage, both physical and emotional. Chuck remains at her side, not just out of duty, but out of the same fierce love that kept him in hospital rooms for years. He still wakes up every day with purpose, but it's a quieter one now. There are no film sets, no red carpets, no martial arts tournaments. His focus is on his family. The twins, Dakota and Danilee, are now in their 20s, young adults shaped not by fame, but by the reality of watching their mother suffer and their father fight to keep the family together. But Chuck's life today isn't only about what's present, it's also about what's missing. The ghosts of the past still follow him. His brother Wieland, gone at 21 in Vietnam. His first wife Diane, with whom he shared 30 years and 2 sons. His daughter Dina, whose childhood he never got to be part of. His friend Lee Atwater, gone far too young. And now, the ongoing pain of watching Gina's body battle a condition they never saw coming. Every corner of the ranch carries echoes. Chuck has admitted that even though he's surrounded by beauty, the silence can be deafening. At night, when the world quiets down and the sun disappears behind the hills, memories return like whispers, reminding him of everything life has taken and everything it's given back. The physical changes have come too. Chuck still trains, but his workouts are slower now. His reflexes, once lightning fast, have softened. The once iron frame of a martial arts legend now carries the natural aches of age, and for a man who was once thought of as indestructible, these daily reminders are their own kind of heartbreak. But Chuck has never measured strength by appearance. In interviews, he said that true toughness isn't about how many fights you win, it's about how many times you stand back up. And over the course of 8 decades, Chuck has stood back up again and again. He's not chasing the spotlight anymore. He's chasing something more valuable. Time. Time with Gina. Time with his kids. Time to appreciate the stillness that once felt impossible to find. And in that time, he's also continued his commitment to helping others. He still supports Kickstart Kids, a program he founded in 1990 to teach martial arts and life skills to at-risk youth. For Chuck, it's not about technique. It's about giving kids the same outlet that saved him when he was a scared teenager in Oklahoma. Because if there's one thing he's never forgotten, it's where he came from. Behind the movies, the trophies, and the myths, Chuck Norris is a man who clawed his way out of poverty, who faced down abuse, grief, guilt, and regret, and who never stopped trying to do better. And even now, he's not done. He knows that age doesn't mean weakness, that vulnerability doesn't mean defeat, and that love, whether in a marriage, a friendship, or a memory, is still the most powerful force of all. Chuck Norris may no longer be invincible, but he's never been more human. Chuck Norris has been many things: a champion, a movie star, a teacher, and a father. But today he's something even more powerful, a survivor. He survived the trauma of an abusive home. He survived poverty so intense that his family couldn't always afford food. He survived failure, heartbreak, betrayal, and unimaginable loss. And now, at 85 years old, he walks each day with those memories still etched into his heart. But here's the most surprising part. He's not bitter. Chuck doesn't talk about regret the way most people do. He doesn't pretend everything worked out perfectly, but he also doesn't let pain define him. In his own words, true invincibility isn't never breaking. It's learning how to rise again after you do. His legacy isn't just the films or championships. It's the way he responded to life when it got messy, unfair, or cruel. He didn't just punch through doors on screen. He pushed through walls that most people would have collapsed under. Walls made of grief, guilt, and loss. And instead of hiding from it, he chose to speak honestly about it. That honesty is part of what makes Chuck's story so lasting. He's never pretended to be perfect. He's admitted when he failed as a father, when he was absent, when pride got in the way. But then he did something that's even harder. He tried to make it right, and that's why people still respect him decades after his peak fame. Now, his days are quieter. The loudest sound on his ranch might be the wind through the trees, or the laughter of his children when they visit. Gina still needs care, and Chuck remains by her side, ever present, ever watchful, always devoted. The man who once trained for hours to sharpen his kicks now spends time reading scripture, tending to horses, and supporting his favourite causes. He no longer chases trophies. What he values now is time, real time, with people he loves, doing things that matter. And yet the strength remains, just in a different form. It's no longer in his fists, it's in his patience, in the way he listens, in the way he holds Gina's hand, knowing every moment counts, in the way he shows up for his grown children, not with advice or expectations, but simply with presence, and the people around him feel it. Whether it's his staff, his students, or his neighbours, they all speak about the same thing. Chuck doesn't need to be loud to be powerful. He's calm, steady and focused, just like the heroes he played on screen. But now, instead of saving the day with action scenes, he saves it by simply showing up, by choosing love over everything else. His ranch may be peaceful, but the story it holds is anything but. It holds memories of sleepless nights by hospital beds, of phone calls delivering the worst news imaginable, of standing in front of cameras while carrying invisible grief, of personal wars fought with no audience, no applause, and no certainty of victory. And still, Chuck remains standing. There is no reboot waiting, no final movie in the works, no dramatic return to the screen. This chapter is about peace and about reflection. It's about showing the world one last time that true strength isn't found in how hard you hit, but in how gently you hold on to the people who matter. Chuck Norris's tragedy is real, but so is his triumph.